This is a family theory presentation on Betty Neuman's systems model. Betty Neuman's systems model of nursing originated in the 1970s. She said she was developing the systems model in order to provide unity or a focal point for students' learning. There were 3 iterations of the systems model, with the third and final edition finished in the 1990s. This is a conceptual model that was generated in order to present a visual representation of the interactions between the nurses, the family, and the family's environment. This model shows the family as a layered, multidimensional whole system that has constant interactions with different aspects of the environment. The layers here represent various levels of how the family can defend itself in order to protect the core being. There are 2 major components to the Neuman's model. The first is stress reactions. These are reactions of the family to different sources of stress with lines of defense and resistance. The reactions or exchanges between the environment and the family are influenced one by the other. The other major component to Neuman's model are systematic feedback loops. These are used to fine-tune the defensive lines and to achieve maximum stability. Neuman names the person as the center of the model. This can also be replaced by a group, community, or by the family. I will refer to the person from here on out as the family. The family has 5 interrelated personal variables that together form the family being analyzed. The first is spiritual, which includes aspects of spirituality from denial or unawareness range to high levels of spiritual understanding. Developmental are age-appropriate processes. Sociocultural functions for social expectation. This also includes relationships. Psychological and physiological. Each family system has a central core. This central core is composed of common human factors for survival. Neuman identifies these as the keys to achieving health, and they are ego, response, genetic patterns, temperature control, and organ function. In order to protect these central core aspects, the family implements lines of defense. There are 3 types. The first are flexible lines of defense. This is the outermost ring that functions as a barrier or a buffer for the family's normal state. This line keeps the system free from stressors and is highly dependent on the amount of sleep, nutritional status, and the quality and quantity of stress that the family experiences. Failure of this line activates the lines of resistance. The next are normal lines of defense. This is the middle ring that represents the family's typical wellness state. It is a dynamic ring that is constantly fluctuating. Lines of resistance are the third. This is represented by the innermost ring. This ring is involuntarily activated when stressors blow past the normal lines of defense. It is the last line of defense. If there is prolonged exposure to the stressor in this area, the possibility of death is much higher. The environment is defined correlating to where the stressors are generated. The first is the internal environment. This is where intrapersonal stressors come from, and they are those things such as physical body stressors, like an infection. The next is external environment. These are interpersonal stressors. They are those that occur between the family and outside forces. The last is the created environment. This is developed by the unconscious mind and is ultimately a symbol of the system as a whole. It can supersede both the internal and the external environments, and the majority of times it acts as a defense mechanism. Now onto stress. Neumann looked at the impact that stressors had on systems and was able to determine 3 main types of stressors. The first is intrapersonal. This is the stress that occurs within a person. They can be emotions, feelings, or ideas. The next type of stressor is interpersonal. This type of stress occurs between different people, such as those in role expectations, personal interactions, or personal events. The third is extrapersonal. These stressors are ones that occur outside of the individual or family. It can include employment stressors, stressors from the community, or financial pressures. Stressors are not only capable of creating a negative effect, but positive ones as well. These stressors are part of the environmental forces that affect the family system. The family's response to the stressors is dependent on the strengths of the lines of defense that were outlined in the model earlier. The nurse is known as the responsible party, and their goal is to achieve peak system balance and stability. The main way that this is done from a nursing standpoint is through interventions, and Neumann breaks these into 3 specific groups. The first is primary interventions. These are things that happen before the system reacts to the stressor. These interventions include things such as health promotion or overall wellness improvements. It can also include manipulations to the environment to reduce or weaken the stressors. The goal of these interventions is to strengthen the flexible lines of defense and to protect the normal line of defense. Secondary interventions occur after the system reacts to the stressor. These focus on preventing damage to the family core through the strengthening of the internal lines of resistance, or altogether removing the stressor. The nurse's job in this role is to encourage healthy reactions to stress, to give access to the family different resources for use, and to protect the core family structure. Tertiary interventions are those that occur after the family has been given the opportunity to utilize secondary preventions. They are supportive measures that help to redirect the family in order to recover from the stressor event. In regards to family application, in a guide to care for emotionally disturbed children and families by these two researchers, they stated that each individual has their own essential core. These cores, when grouped within a family system, create a mesh of family traits, behaviors, values, and beliefs that serve as scaffolding for the family unit. They continue to say that Neuman's model provides a clear method for making diagnosis of family breakdown and for planning therapeutic approaches. Here are two studies that demonstrated the use of the Neuman systems model. The first study aimed at assisted patients who suffered from multiple sclerosis. The main focus of this study was the application of and utilization of nursing interventions based on Neuman's model. From an assessment utilizing her model, over 12 nursing diagnoses were completed and interventions implemented to address several stressors identified. The intrapersonal stressors were identified as physiological, psychological, sociocultural, and spiritual. The interpersonal stressors were being away from family and children. The extrapersonal stressors were from aggression and psychological pressure from the spouse. Multiple sclerosis is a disease with a range of symptoms that can cause disabling functional consequences for the patient. This leads to significant reduction in the patient's quality of life and the ability of the patient to fulfill their role and carry out job tasks. Seeing that approaching the situation from a nursing theory standpoint allows for more variety and flexibility, this provides understanding and pinpointing of certain aspects that result in the individual's crisis. The scenario of multiple sclerosis is most definitely warranting a more holistic approach that is offered by the systems model. An additional study was conducted that utilized Neuman's model in a more preventative and educational setting for patients who were going to be completing a coronary artery bypass graft. The study was composed of 64 patients who were evaluated utilizing Neuman's model. The purpose was to evaluate the overall stressors to the core being variables, and then utilize nursing interventions during the hospital stay and after discharge in order to decrease the influence of these stressors. Improvements were seen for the patient's stressor scores prior to discharge, and identification of the strengthening of the patient's lines of defense was also noted. Interestingly, the focus after the study was completed was the potential for identifying gaps in communities and families regarding education and the investment of nursing theory into community health measures in general. In conclusion, I find Neuman's model very compelling to utilize in my family assessment project. It approaches family nursing in a holistic view, identifying the family as the core unit and branching out into the many core areas that the family has deemed important. It also allows for the family to participate more through the identification of their own stressors, the utilization of the nurse to provide their interventions, and to help them set goals to improve their own lines of defense. I want to apply this model for my family that I wish to utilize in my assessment assignment because of the many changes and stressors that they are going through currently in their life. Being able to work with them will not only help me understand the strength of nursing theory utilization, but to also give them tools to help resolve stress and strengthen their family core unit. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation of Betty Neuman's systems model.